We're going to keep it moving. And our next panel will go into greater depth on the state of large landscape goals in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Now, this panel is going to be introduced and moderated by Dr. Rebecca Gruby, Dr. Gruby is an associate professor in the human dimensions of natural resources, the department at Colorado State University, and her expertise lies in the politics and practice of environmental governance. Her research engages multidisciplinary perspectives across the social sciences to understand and inform conservation and governments in diverse settings, especially marine environments. But before we hear from Rebecca and our esteemed panel, we're going to watch a short video on Indigenous protected and conserved areas to provide some additional context for Indigenous conservation in Canada. So please roll the video.
The protected and conserved areas work. It's really about loving places that are amazing.
Indigenous people in Canada have been leading conservation efforts for decades. This includes the establishment of Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, to protect lands and waters we all depend upon. IPCAs are places that Indigenous nations identify for conservation, often through community-driven processes. Indigenous communities determine the goal for IPCAs and manage lands.
I have a vested interest. I have two little grandsons that are 4 and 2 years old. I want them to be able to enjoy the benefits of what the natural wilderness is able to provide you.
Sometimes you don't understand that until you're on the land and you're traveling on the water. You're participating in a setting where you're connecting. For our communities, it's a vital part of who we are.
IPCAs are often designated through Indigenous law and then through partnership agreements with Crown governments. IPCAs have already been established in places like Tusu-Denilin Tuyata, Edeji, and Tada-Denene.
Tada-Denene establishment agreement is one of the most progressive, modern type of agreement where we will co-create, govern, manage, and operate Tada-Denene together equally.
Dozens more IPCAs have been proposed. Taken together, IPCA proposals could conserve over 500,000 square kilometers of the boreal forest region. Indigenous-led conservation offers the best way to reach Canada's goal of protecting 25% of lands by 2025, part of the global effort to address huge losses of animals and plants.
I'd be really humbled and pleased to be a part of that as a Canadian, but also, as an Indigenous person, to be able to have that opportunity to protect our land.
IPCAs honor the relationship between people and the land. They ensure lands and cultures will thrive into the future.
Maybe if other Canadians could look at our land and see what we see, maybe, just maybe, they would want to protect it too.
Learn more about IPCAs at ilinationhood.ca.
Thank you very much. Take it away, Rebecca.
Okay, hi everyone. As Luis mentioned, my name is Rebecca Gruby, and I'm thrilled to be here today to moderate this panel. We have a stellar lineup of representatives from Canada, the US, and Mexico to discuss what steps each country has taken to get national conservation goals off the ground in their respective countries. First, we'll hear from Nadine Spence. Nadine is a Hausat First Nation member, part of the larger Nuchanuoth tribe on the west coast of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Since 2001, Nadine has worked for Parks Canada as Executive Director of Operations for the British Columbia and Yukon region, where she works with a team to manage national parks, historic sites, and marine conservation areas. Next, we'll hear from Brian O'Donnell. For more than 2 decades, Brian has been a leading land and wildlife conservationist. Brian works as the director of the Campaign for Nature to increase global targets and financing for protected areas under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And finally, we will hear from Andrew Rhodes Espinoza. Andrew is currently Ocean Coordinator with the Undersecretariat for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Mexico, and is Sous Sherpa for the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. Prior to this, he held executive positions in the National Commission for Protected Natural Areas and was General Director of Institutional Development and, and Promotion, and Director of Climate Change Strategies. Over to you, Nadine.
Thank you very much. Apologize for the little technical glitch there. The internet is a little slow here in Victoria this morning. Bon matin tout le monde. Je m'appelle Nadine Spence. Je travaille pour Parc Canada en tant que directrice exécutive d'opérations en Colombie-Britannique au Yukon. Class Klieta is for Parks Canada. And so today I'm here to talk to you about lessons learned from the planning of Canada's Pathway to Canada Target 1. So just to set the context for everyone, Canada Target 1 is a reflection of HE Target 11, part of the 2020 Biodiversity Goals and Targets, where we were searching to protect 17% of lands and waters within the Canadian territory. The map you see at the corner of your screen is a reflection of where we were at when commencing the planning process for Pathway in 2016, where there were 10.5% of Canada's terrestrial and inland waters that were protected, almost exclusively through protected areas. And just to give you a sense of scale, so each percentage of protection in Canada is 100,000 square kilometers. So the gap that we had to make up was 6.5%, or the second graph at the bottom there, that hockey stick, very Canadian like graphic, that represents 650,000 square kilometers, or equivalent the size of one of our prairie provinces of Alberta or Saskatchewan. So how were we going to do that? We knew that in looking back and researching that it took us over 150 years to reach the 10.5%. So it was clear that we had to do things differently in order to accelerate opportunities for protection and collaboration. We did this with new types of collaboration with provinces and territories, enabling Indigenous leadership with private landowners and municipalities, and other jurisdictional considerations, such as the fact that in Canada, 85% of crown lands, so most of the lands in Canada are crown lands, are under the authority of provinces and territories, so not the federal government, except for the band around the border with the United States, which is where you will find some of our highest areas of biodiversity in the country, and a greater degree of private land ownership, often regulated through municipalities. So that's the context of the work that we were undertaking. Oops, sorry, I think I'm on slide 3, and that's what I just spoke to. So I'll give everyone a moment to take a look at the graphs and map that I had mentioned. So how did we do that? This is a schematic that represents the kind of the various processes and groups involved in developing the planning process for Pathway to Canada Target 1. I was privileged to co-lead a national steering committee, you can see there the middle of the graphic, for Canada with the government of Alberta to design the process and to develop the plan on behalf of the co-lead ministers from Alberta and Canada. And the main elements of the process was a national advisory panel, a ministerial appointed national advisory panel that included all elements of those who needed to be involved or were implicated in planning for and implementation of increasing our conservation efforts across the country. So we had industries, different types of industries. We had environmental, non-governmental organizations, academia, Indigenous peoples, and others who participated in this panel, lending their expertise and their knowledge in developing a plan to surmount this great goal that we had. As well, we had an Indigenous circle of experts, which is at the bottom of the screen there. So a group of conservation experts from across the country, Indigenous peoples who once again lent their expertise with a particular focus on the development of a new concept in Canada, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, new to governments, long in existence in Indigenous cultures and practices. But it was an opportunity to bring different actors together to understand each other's needs and desires, kind of areas of intersection and how we might work together. And then a whole suite, as you can see down the sidebar there, of expert task teams that included, intergovernmental representation, academia, environmental, non-governmental organizations in areas of the qualitative elements of the target, which in our collective view were equally as important as the numerical target that we were seeking. So I will just leave this for a moment to share with you kind of the goal and the principles that were undertaken, and you can see the reports there that can be found online that were the results of the planning process. I'd like to speak to a particular element of the planning process that I think is pretty fundamental to how we went about planning and executing the work that we undertook, and that created a really important space for new knowledges to kind of emerge to help us address the challenge before us. So we undertook a process called Ethical Space. It's a guiding process that was shared to us by elders early on in the pathway process. It became a fundamental way to move forward in respectful co-development. Ethical Space offers a framework for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and knowledge systems to interact in a respectful way and contribute equally and meaningfully in the decision-making process. And it is framed by, in Canada, we have Aboriginal rights and treaties are protected by the Canadian Constitution under Section 35, and other key documents such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it really is about an opportunity to ensure that two knowledge systems kind of coexist and validate, cross-validate with one another, but really respecting the base from which they come. So I'd like to just share a couple of the emergent themes that we saw throughout the process before kind of moving to the key takeaways and lessons learned. So adaptive management, that seems really, really obvious. Yet I think sometimes there's a big gap between theory and practice. And so it requires a dedicated eye on, sorry, I've been in French lately, so everything's coming to me in French. A real eye on ensuring that our words and our actions are coherent, and that we in fact are able to demonstrate through our actions that we are listening to those that we are working with and actively changing our process as a consequence. We prioritize co-development. So what is co-development? It is in effect the sharing of power in the process itself. And it really is an acknowledgement that everyone who participates in the process has something really valuable to bring. And our collective efforts and successes will be reflective of the degree to which we raise people's voices, listen and understand people's perspectives, and leverage that knowledge, which is bullet 4. I spoke to Ethical Space, so I won't expand upon that more than to say that we were really fortunate to have Dr. Croshoe, who is a member of the National Advisory Panel, introduce the concept of ethical space to us at the very first meeting of the pathway. So this is not something that the Government of Canada or Parks Canada brought to the table, but rather it was something that Dr. Croshoe brought to the table, and we were fortunate to have a large group of actors who were really open to creative and innovative ways of working together. So ethical space and practice includes, in Canada at least, ensuring that we reflected Indigenous ways of knowing, including the incorporation of ceremony to validate commitments and knowledge to one another. I shared with you a number of guiding principles. Those two, along with the ceremony, were important touch points rather for us to go back to in points of divergent views or conflict, to remind ourselves of our collective commitments and work our way through the conflict by honoring the principles that we had agreed to and the ceremony that we validated those principles in. And clearly, a challenge like this requires new kinds of tools and new types of partnerships. So that's where we formalized ensuring kind of coherency and consistency with international guidance on things like other effective area-based conservation measures in a Canadian context, the development of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which, like I said, have existed for almost all time in Indigenous communities, just called different things. And in the international community, of course, we call them ICCEAs, but this is a Canadianized version based on a lot of engagement done with Indigenous peoples across the country. In-term protection, focus on connectivity, and working with other actors that aren't necessarily normally in kind of the center of the protected areas discussions. So just some photos of the efforts and work that we were undertaking. I'm just going to leave this here for a moment. I'm not going to read out the quotes, but what we're trying to illustrate here is just the fact that we had many knowledge holders with depths of experience involved in this process, and each and every one, I think the process itself, the design of the process allowed everyone to give their very best, and together we created something much more, much bigger than we could have done, through a typical government process. And on the government side of the house, that means that we have to let go of control sometimes, and really just be a good convener. So the main takeaways that I would share with you from our process was very much, bringing people early into the process to develop shared commitment and ownership over the goals. Again, these are very active in nature. This isn't a passive or a one-time kind of conversation. It's an iterative and active one, which leads to the next one, which is ensuring the definition of success is well understood by all. Success meant different things to different people. So for provinces and territories, they shared with us that from the very beginning, their active collaboration was contingent upon focusing on the qualitative elements of the target, not only the numerical target. So they really wanted to ensure that the efforts reflected, a better way of doing things and better outcomes for conservation. I mentioned the role of the government of Canada. Well, in this case, we really were a convener, a facilitator, an enabler, a listener. It's knowing when to, internally, we had to work very hard to ensure the government processes that aren't designed for necessarily such big inclusive processes like this were receptive to it. So internally, we had lots of work to do in that regard around communication. But externally, that meant that we were fortunate to benefit from the knowledge and experience of those involved, like the National Advisory Panel, like the Indigenous Circle of Experts. We also had a Council of Municipal Governments that provided advice to us as well, given that more than 80% of Canadians live in urban centers. And we know that part of this challenge is the question of capturing hearts and minds. So if they don't believe in our efforts to grow protection and how it impacts them and why it's important, you know, the results will be very short term. The importance of being thoughtfully inclusive, and I think this is, you know, was important then, but given kind of the context that we find ourselves in today, active conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think it's even more so a relevant aspect today. So a key factor in that would be just ensuring that people have their we're careful not to speak on others' behalfs, but create the space for people and groups to speak for themselves, and then to create the kind of the forums for dialogue, to work through kind of understandings and issues and challenges and opportunities, quite frankly. A good process with many voices and shared ownership takes time. Again, fairly self-evident, yet in the world of government, we know we have certain predetermined timelines to meet. And in a process so multifaceted, it necessitates that we have kind of shifting and changing deadlines and milestones in order to accommodate for the broader engagement necessary to get everyone on the same page of support to move forward together. So it just means that we are literally adapting in the moment in any given day, while ensuring that the big milestones aren't slipping in terms of setting governments up to bring the plan home, for example, to their respective jurisdiction in their processes to work through their own kind of respective parliamentary and cabinet processes. Last slide and last series of takeaways. So communication is just essential. So it really is focusing in on starting where people are at, different groups, different segments of society. There are different spokespeople that speak better to those various segments of society. So just being highly purposeful around how and what we do to communicate the purpose and the need, and quite frankly, up to and including the personal impact of what we are trying to do on individuals, groups, communities, and at the societal level. Embracing difficult conversations. I am proud to say that I think that this was a hallmark of the work that we did. It's very easy to kind of skip over points of divergence, but really kind of ensuring that, you know, differences go to dialogue speaks to the resiliency of the decisions that we were speaking. So we wanted these decisions to have have resiliency over the next couple of decades, not a couple short years, because the goal is so great that it requires all of our collective effort to make it happen. Creating new protected areas takes years, and it's critical to look for new tools and partnerships. And I want to be clear that that does not mean that we forego, you know, our protected area systems. They still need to be foundation blocks for everything that we do, because they provide, as we know, important spaces for adaptation, for species at risk, for all sorts of other important reasons. But rather, it's looking at kind of knitting together a series of tools that look at issues on the large landscape scale. Connected networks of protected areas are much more effective, and not just protected areas, but always other effective area-based conservation measures, Indigenous protected and conserved areas. If we have objectives that scale landscapes at the same scale that we have to deal with some of these, you know, wicked problems that we're dealing with, like climate change, the climate change crisis, and biodiversity loss, this is where we necessarily need to go. And finally, relationships matter. So the foundation to all of all of the work that was undertaken and the plans that subsequently were developed really were founded on relationships. And once again, I would just underscore, it doesn't mean that everything's perfect all the time, but it does mean that there has to be a real commitment to not only the what we do, but the way that we do it. And that has to be consistent over time. And we have to very purposefully live our values in that. So I will stop there, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our experience.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for that fascinating talk. I look forward to discussing further in the Q&A. But first, we're going to be hearing from Brian O'Donnell.
Hello, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to join you today. And thank you to Nadine for your remarks. And exciting to see the news from Canada, especially the leadership of First Nations in meeting the area-based conservation goals. I'm Brian O'Donnell, Director of Campaign for Nature, and I am joining you today from the ancestral and current lands of the Ute and Puebloan people. Here in the United States, we are relatively new to the game of trying to implement a national goal. We've obviously had decades and decades of experience in conservation and protected and conserved areas, but not in the context of a national goal. So there's quite a bit to learn from Canada's approach. Just in terms of setting the scene of where we stand now in the United States, there is an incredibly high level of grassroots and public enthusiasm for the 30 by 30 goal. It has really been a bottom-up effort that is being embraced by pockets of leaders throughout the country. In fact, recent polling showed that 86% of voters in the United States support a national 30 by 30 goal. I know many of you are watching from Canada or Mexico where you don't follow US politics, but you should know that 86% of Americans don't agree on anything. So the fact that we agree overwhelmingly on the importance of protecting 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030, that is a unifying event in America and something that we should celebrate. An even greater percentage, 95% of people support establishing marine protected areas. So this huge enthusiasm for the sport of 30 by 30 is really about helping to safeguard nature, addressing the loss in biodiversity, certainly the huge impact that nature conservation can have in addressing the climate change crisis that we face and providing those outdoor opportunities for people that we all cherish in the United States. This public enthusiasm has started to translate into some action from elected leaders across the country. We're starting to see this really bubble up from states. In fact, California, the state that first embraced this goal back in October of 2020, issued an executive order when Governor Newsom set a statewide target for protecting 30% of California's land and marine areas by 2030. In Illinois, a really exciting development when high school students at Pontiac Township High School convinced the state legislature that they should have a statewide goal for 30 by 30, and the Illinois state legislature recently unanimously approved a task force to help achieve that goal in the state of Illinois. Similarly, in New York, lawmakers in the state Senate passed legislation that would set a goal to conserve at least 30% of New York's lands and oceans. And just last month, on August 25th, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signed an executive order to establish a statewide goal of protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030. So it's really exciting to see this action. We've also seen other states, including Michigan and in Nevada, pass statewide resolutions supporting this goal of protecting and conserving 30% of their lands. And Hawaii, with its just incredible marine resources, committed to effectively manage 30% of its nearshore marine environments by 2030. So a lot of action happening on the state level, and it's exciting to see that progress. Some of you may have heard and will certainly hear more details about the federal efforts, the national efforts that the Biden administration is doing on 30 by 30. In the first month in office, the Biden administration set a national goal of conserving at least 30% of lands and waters through an executive order. This is a major milestone in US conservation history, as we haven't had that national target before, certainly not at this scale. And it's really incredible that the Biden administration has embraced it and provided that early leadership. We've seen in the US some early guidance from the federal government as to what that goal will entail, how the US will meet it. But we all know that more specific guidance is needed and forthcoming. And so I, like the rest of you watching the symposium, are looking forward to hearing from leaders in the Biden administration as to what are the steps and processes that the US government sees in meeting this goal, because we know 2030 is coming relatively quickly here. Hard to believe that we're already most of the way through 2021. Meanwhile, proponents at the grassroots level of the 30 by 30 goal have put forward 5 key principles for meeting the 30 by 30 goal in the US. And I think these are important, and many of them are similar to what you heard just earlier from Canada. First, it's critical that we support locally led conservation. I believe we can only reach this goal by doing more to help communities protect the places that matter most to them, and that really it's this local, state, tribal, and regional needs that are going to drive this agenda. So locally supported conservation is essential. Second, it's critical that we have a more equitable and inclusive vision for nature conservation. We know that the impacts of biodiversity loss, of pollution, and other environmental degradation has been felt most in communities of color, in low-income communities, and therefore we need to make sure that as we pursue a national 30 by 30 goal, we address this legacy and we have an equitable approach to ensure that the benefits are received by all people, improving access to outdoor spaces for those who are at the front lines of nature conservation, and also those who have had limited access to nature because of degraded systems. You may have seen the Hispanic Access Foundation recently released an important report on how we can effectively ensure equity in reaching the 30 by 30 goal. I think that's an excellent opportunity to read that report and to engage in a process that we do ensure that equity is front and center. Third, I think that tribal nations, just as we heard from First Nations in Canada, must be at the center of reaching the 30 by 30 goal, and we must honor the sovereignty of tribal nations. Many of the most important and best conserved natural, cultural, and historic resources in the United States are under the ownership and stewardship of American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities. And so their vision for achieving 30 by 30, their traditional ecological knowledge and approach and a respect for their sovereignty must continue to be a core component of 30 by 30. I think we're seeing a move towards this globally, certainly a move towards this in Canada, and the United States needs to move towards this in a major way. All of the land in the United States is Indigenous land. And so we need to recognize that in pursuing a 30 by 30 agenda, this must be taken into account. Fourth, private land conservation is also going to be key to reaching this goal. We know that private property rights are incredibly important here in the United States, and we must respect those. We also know that much of the nation's biodiversity is concentrated on private lands. In lower valleys, we see an abundance of biodiversity in the southeastern United States that has not had the level of conservation that we've seen in some of the western states. And so how do we ensure that private landowners, through their voluntary efforts, can help us meet this goal? That'll take financing, it'll take leadership, it'll take working with those who work on farms, ranches, and other areas to ensure that they are included in this vision, because that's essential to have the biodiversity outcomes that we're seeking in the 30 by 30 goal. And the fifth key component is to be guided by science. We know that this goal must be a scientific target. We heard from Carl and Stephen Woodley in the first panel about what should count. How do we ensure that we're protecting the right places that are key to ensure the greatest protection for our country's wildlife, the greatest benefits for the services that nature provides to people? So science must guide us. But it is clear that from the science that we need to move more rapidly than we have been doing in recent months and years. We know we're in an ecological and climate emergency. And in my mind, the grassroots enthusiasm for the target is not being met with the same level of action or finance that is going to keep us on track to meet the 30 by 30 goal. In fact, in some of the areas, we're actually moving backwards. We just saw a huge lease sale of tens of millions of acres of oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. That's not moving towards conservation, that's moving towards more of the destructive practices that got us into this climate and ecological emergency. An immediate first step to start heading us into this more conservation vision on the federal level would be to restore the Bears Ears National Monument. Many of you may have seen an article in today's Washington Post with tribes calling for immediate action. So I hope that President Biden will heed that call and use this as a first step towards major federal leadership in getting us on track to 30 by 30. Because I mentioned 2030 is coming up very quickly. We are in this ecological and climate emergency. It's time that we accelerate our conservation action. We also know that in states like New Mexico, we're seeing national forest management plans that'll set long-term management paradigms for these national forests are being done without new meaningful conservation measures included in the plans that would identify how we reach 30 by 30. So while we've had this great vision from the top, it hasn't yet reached down into those land managers. And I think that's critical. That has to happen immediately because we need to meet this 30 by 30 goal. And I understand it's relatively early in the Biden administration, but I must stress that the United States has to act more quickly with clear leadership to meet this goal. And that also extends to the US Congress, where finance needs to be a major part of this equation. Finally, I want to make sure that we're thinking about this not just in terms of our own borders, which is why it's so exciting to be on a panel with leaders in Canada and New Mexico. We know that jaguars and ocelots rely on habitat both in the US and in Mexico. Our birds, butterflies, salmon, and whales all rely on the conservation measures of our neighbors to the north and south. The porcupine caribou herd migrates between Alaska and the US and Canada. And we also know that our indigenous peoples have not recognized these borders that have divided their nations. So taking this holistic view with connectivity and working together to make this 30 by 30 vision a success in the United States, in North America, and in the world is critically important. So I look forward to hearing more from the other panelists and hearing more from government leaders on how we can all work together for this inspiring vision to safeguard nature in North America. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Lastly, we'll hear from Andrew before we'll have a panel discussion.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good morning to you all. Muy buenos días. It is without any doubt an honor to be here with you, share spaces with Brian, Nadine, and Rebecca. Again, thank you for that introduction. I feel full of enthusiasm as North America discusses renewed leadership towards a 30 by 30 global target. I truly believe there's a huge opportunity of cooperation and collaboration in North America, and the differences and the context of our countries make us, without any doubt, even stronger. So today I'm going to just give you a short sort of presentation related to lessons learned, and specifically to an exercise that we are undergoing in Mexico of, let's say, what we learned from the last CBD strategic planning process, the famous Aichi Target 11, and how Mexico is starting to discuss towards the new biodiversity framework and the new goals. So a discussion on those elements of area-based conservation measures related to sustainable development, the 30 by 30. So I'm going to give you this very short presentation of what we've learned up to now. I just want to highlight and recognize the fundamental work undergone by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Environment in Mexico, the National Statistics Office, and obviously CONABIO and many other agencies in Mexico that have done collaboratively this work. And just to highlight that, together with WRI Mexico and WWF, we've been doing this report with many other ministries and agencies here in the country. Just as a quick reference, there. I tried to look for a photograph close to your heart there in Colorado. And I found this picture from the Rocky Mountain National Park that I took some years ago when I was there visiting your parks. And this is just like a kind of a reflection that I want to share with you, recognizing that there's a lot of diversity, scales, contexts, realities that sum up into this huge a picture of nature that we see, and that is fundamental to understand. In the previous, let's say, session, Stephen Woodley, a very dear friend, was stating about the process towards the 30 by 30, the party discussing these new targets, among many other elements. And it's fundamental to bring that towards the national context between developing countries, and different realities. So this picture is just a reminder of things are changing, and it's not as simple as a clear guidance from one agency. And in that sense, as I said before, Mexico decided to develop this first ever technical report on area-based conservation measures that could identify opportunities to meet the goals of the post-2020 agenda of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In our legislation, area-based measures is not clearly defined. So we first had to obviously have the discussion on what is an area-based measure in our country, together with different agencies and ministries, both obviously for the terrestrial, aquatic, and coastal marine ecosystems, and recognize also the complexity of this approach in these different realms. Then do a sort of baseline analysis of how today those area-based recognized in our legislation can contribute to the country's position in relation to the post-2020 new framework. And many other processes that obviously relate to this, like the Climate Change Convention, even the High-Level Panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy, among others. And hopefully this document, this technical report, first ever technical report, could be replicated in other countries at different scales, different contexts. But it's been, without any doubt, a very interesting first discussion for our country. So without getting into much of the details and trying to set the criteria that will help us identify from our current legislation and federal legislation what could be recognized as an area-based conservation measure, we decided to establish in a consensus this criteria that you see in the screen, but also and taking advantage of, again, Stephen Woosley's presentation and that reference to the 3 conditions work from Harvey Locke. We also decided to, well, let's take a look at the other elements that contribute to restoration and sustainable use in our country. So it's not only protection, strict protection, but other area-based measures that could contribute explicitly to restoration and sustainable use. And since the beginning of I believe, mid last year, pandemics is just messing my head up. We've undergone different discussions in the country. We even held a webinar to discuss this with a graphic interpreter that sum up some of the lessons learned from the discussion, recognizing that we're talking about pieces of a sort of jigsaw puzzle that could complement, let's say, 100% of the country. And the complexity between the marine, the coastal, the terrestrial realm here in the country, but how to sum up all these pieces in a coherent, systemic, holistic approach in the country. So we did a first analysis, and we identified, let's say, these 13 different measures proposed by agencies and ministries in the country that contribute to protection, sustainable use, and restoration. I just want to highlight that those measures identified is just a very short list of an entire portfolio that we identified. But within consensus, within discussion, we got to these, let's say, 13 area-based measures that you can identify. Obviously, protected areas included there. And as you can see, many of them, the principal goal, objective, defined in the legislation, it's towards protection. And some of them are not within, let's say, the environmental sector. So that's something really interesting. And the second obvious key takeaway message from this list is that we have some obviously focused on sustainable use, but if you look at the table, there's non-area-based let's say conservation measures that the principal objective is restoration. We have programs, policies, and some other elements, but not an area-based measure that his primary objective is restoration. So we obviously took that into a GIS map, show it in the screen for you, different colors showing obviously these area-based measures that I just mentioned before, and it gives you more or less how they are distributed all around the country nowadays. No, so in general speaking, there's a sort of combination of colors that you can obviously see in this map, covering an important part of the percentage of the country. So this is baseline. This is what we have already right now here in the country. The question is it effectively protected? Is it effectively conserving? Is it effectively contributing to restoration? That's another question that I'll try to just give a first approach. And again, this is preliminary results from the technical report that hopefully by the end of this year we'll have it. And it's an input for the discussion of the post-2020 framework. But without any doubt, an excellent exercise to start discussing lessons learned from at least Mexico. How do we avoid some of the let's say opportunities and challenges that we learned from IH Target 11? Just to show you in different colors what are those area-based measures that contribute specifically to obviously sustainable use and conservation throughout the country, just to give you a sort of distribution of and percentages and areas covered by these measures. But with a enormous capacity and without the leadership of CONABIO, the National Commission for Biodiversity here in Mexico, one of our leading institutions in knowledge for biodiversity, they led into what I believe it's a very wide opening analysis of, okay, what are the ecosystem integrity conditions of these area-based conservation measures throughout the country? How are they conserved? So generally speaking, we as I said before, there's a big amount of percentage of the country covered right now with area-based conservation measures, but not necessarily in a a conserved state. No, there's a huge opportunity still. This is just, again, a preliminary and a results analysis, but it gives you a clear idea that we have to work, as said by many colleagues before, on the quality elements of percentages. It's not just expansion, but we need to work with the quality elements of the area-based conservation measures in the new targets proposed. Elements like connectivity, without any doubt, in a changing climate, it's fundamental. We need to think about resilience, plasticity of these area-based measures towards the new target. How we're going to recognize these targets. Who is going to report the targets for the country, either federal, subnational, even local voluntary schemes? It's fundamental to have those discussions to, let's say, move in a clear, intended process towards a full, let's say, an effective and equitable 30 by 30 process. So some of the takeaway messages from this report, as I said before, hopefully by the end of this year we'll have it finalized and widely distributed. There are some area-based measures that could possibly contribute to area-based conservation measures for the marine realm, as obviously marine protected areas, some kind of fishing refuge, which is a very interesting lesson learned, because within the discussion, just to let you know, this is one of the short takeaway messages and gossips that we could have, that the fishing refuge main objective in situ, let's say in practical terms, is protection, but it is defined as a sustainable use conservation, a sustainable use measure, because it is within a productive sector that promotes it. Just because of that, it is recognized as sustainable use, even though they effectively contribute to protection. So that's a first takeaway message. The environmental sector by itself is not going to be able to fully achieve a 30 by 30. We need to obviously open the discussion to other sectors that effectively contribute to protection. As Brian stated before, grassroots, local indigenous communities. It's a fundamental area of opportunity. De facto, they contribute in Mexico to street and well-conserved areas. We must work to fully recognize and report those areas in the new target. There's, without any doubt, and just to as a general message, there's a high complexity to do this ecosystem integrity analysis for the coastal marine areas in Mexico. We had the data for the terrestrial, but the marine realm is without any doubt still the big unknown. We have to work on moving in a very fast and aggressive way into the discussion. There's constant changes and migration and distribution shifts of species, populations, ecosystems, and many other elements due to climate change. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing process, and that makes also difficult to identify clear areas for priority areas in countries. We must take this into account. This work wouldn't be done, and I want to recognize the huge effort from CONAVIO, INEGI, the different ministries here in Mexico, still undergoing a discussion towards this. And again, the message is, if we want to aggressively move to a 30 by 30, 50% of whatever, it's fundamental that we rethink and we learn from our past processes. So we need to take what happened in Aichi Target 11, try to incorporate in this new process and be ready for the next decade. And again, as I said it before in the beginning of this talk, I truly believe that North America, with the three capacities, lessons learned, and collaborative work from Canada, the US, and Mexico, can be a world leader towards the 30 by 30. Just as a final remark, we all know that Mexico is a participant of the High Ambition Coalition for People and Nature, and we also recognize the relevance of the 30 by 30 global targets in the commitments of the Heidelberg Panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy. So thank you, Rebecca, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I believe we have about 20 minutes for a panel-wide discussion. And I believe we're also collating some questions from the audience. I want to start with first by thanking you all. Those were excellent presentations and all so interesting in different ways. I want to start with a big picture question to all of you. Each of you mentioned important lessons learned. I want to ask you, based on your experiences and observations, what are the most critical lessons learned that you would want to communicate about getting national programs off the ground in the context of these ambitious new global targets? The most critical lessons that you would like to share. I will just ask you to unmute and go ahead and answer, whoever would like to go first. Go ahead, Brian.
Sure. Well, in the United States, I think it's a new reality, right? We have had a incremental approach to conservation for generations, and that has built up our national park system, our national wilderness preservation system, national monuments, marine protected areas, which have all been, exceptional community-based bottom-up approaches. So I think we need to keep that bottom-up approach where communities are leading, local voices are being heard. And most of these things have passed the US Congress unanimously. So it's that enthusiasm and support. The challenge we face now, though, in an ecological emergency and in a climate emergency, is that the pace that we are doing those is not keeping pace with the destruction and the loss of nature and the loss of biodiversity and the impacts of climate change. So our biggest challenge going forward is, how do we keep that bottom-up, inclusive approach to conservation while also rapidly accelerating the pace to meet the challenges we face in the nation and on the planet? It's a huge challenge, but we've got to figure it out to address these crises.
Great, thank you. Nadine or Andrew? Should we start with you, Nadine, if you'd like to weigh in?
Sure, Rebecca, thanks. So I think that I certainly agree with what Brian just said. I would add that here in Canada, I think it necessitates a continued shift in the way in which we understand and undertake conservation. So what's old is new. And later on today, we're going to hear from exceptional speakers on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. On a personal scale, like myself being Indigenous, my own community, our view of the world is really relational and reciprocal. And so how might we draw lessons learned from Indigenous communities throughout the North Americas that shares that kind of value of being in relation with the land, which has a different, slightly different connotation than the way in which we kind of know and understand conservation up until, you know, recent decades. I think it affords us an opportunity to really to grow conservation in a way that will kind of burst out of the boxes that we currently have. And so I think that that's really important because it shifts our mindset in terms of kind of parsing off, you know, parcels of land here and there, but rather looking at the ways in which they work kind of in an interdependent fashion with a value set over the landscape that that really draws away from those divergent uses and challenges and really speaks to kind of shared outcomes and goals. A little philosophical, but but necessary.
That was great, Nadine. Thanks. Andrew.
Yes, Rebecca. I would start with first managing with clarity. I truly believe that the 30 by 30 must be embraced and have a very clear picture of what we mean by it, by all sectors, from local communities, Indigenous communities, all the way to federal governments, to international multilateral fora. That's fundamental, clarity. Second, and lessons learned. This is not a target that comes from one ministry or one agency. Just to, as a sort of example, Parks Canada is not responsible for 30 by 30. It cannot be responsible. The National Commission for Protected Areas in Mexico cannot be responsible for the 30 by 30. It is a target that must be embraced by all sectors. Recognize the relevance for all sectors, all parties, all stakeholders involved. There's a fundamental gap of capacity building. We need to take advantage of, for instance, the World Commission on Protected Areas as a knowledge broker to help parties move towards a comprehensive 30 by 30 target. We need guidance from different countries, North America, without any doubt, a huge area of opportunity for all the qualitative elements for this 30 by 30. So there's a huge challenge ahead of us, but we must not wait until the crisis, I say the Aichi Target 11 crisis of the last 5 years of expansion. We need to take advantage that the process is starting to get, let's say, our ideas, our targets, our strengths together towards that huge and ambitious goal. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, I've heard that theme come up earlier this morning, and it's coming up now. Again, you know, 30% is obviously an ambitious goal, an ambitious target. A lot of folks are arguing that more is necessary, right? And if we're able to meet these ambitious targets, what other steps or management approaches or sectors do we need to consider, and which actors and stakeholders should be involved? Like specifically, how do we actually make it so that it's not just Parks Canada in charge of the 30% goal? What are some concrete lessons from your experiences about how to sort of mainstream those targets throughout different government agencies or organizations and sectors? Just go ahead and unmute whoever would like to speak first. I think Brian?
Sure, I think that was an excellent question. You know, here in the United States, we know that when Americans think about conservation a lot, they think about the Western United States, and they don't think about it in terms of the whole country. Lots of our protected areas and conserved areas are in the West, the big ones. But we know that to truly meet this biodiversity goal, that means private land has to play a key role. And how do we do that for private landowners? Part of it is to own this goal. It has to be, as I think Andrew said so well, this can't be, just owned by the Forest Service or the National Park Service. This has to be owned by communities, by counties, by individual landowners. That we have to celebrate the idea that we love nature in this country, that we want to have a livable future for our children and our grandchildren, that we want to have the abundance of wildlife that we have appreciated in our lifetimes. And by distributing that sort of power, that enthusiasm, and that approach into millions of people, each to think about what they can do in their own backyards, in their own towns, in their own counties, and in their countries, is going to help us get to this goal. That's the only way we can do it, is by devolving this down to individuals, and also by sharing that enthusiasm and collectively building up to this goal, as I think Andrew put so well.
Nadine or Andrew, would you like to jump in?
I can jump in. So I completely agree with Brian. We must rethink some of the lessons learned. Just to give you an example of the importance of private protected areas, or even community-based indigenous protected areas. In Mexico, we have a specific, let's say, category for federal protected area that is a voluntary scheme. And throughout several years, Mexico has undergone a very interesting work in promoting those voluntary schemes, that is through a certification. No? So a landowner, a community, an ejido can obviously certify X percentage of their lands as a federal PA, and it's recognized as that in our legislation. And it's a long-term commitment among other benefits that they have. Just to give you an example, I had the opportunity at the beginning of this administration and to work collaboratively in this aspect. And 10% in 7 months, 10% of the total area or today certified as a voluntary protected area in Mexico was certified only in 7 months. So I think there's a huge area of opportunity, without any doubt, to identify those schemes and look for innovative financial mechanisms, be creative with them, promote them, make them visible. And it's also an element of communications and I will say even marketing outside there. So there is a huge opportunity to also to seek those opportunities in different contexts, in different legislations in the countries, and move forward. I'm sure that again, from Canada, US, and Mexico, we have plenty of lessons learned that we should share with the rest of the planet.
Maybe I'll jump in here, Rebecca, if that's okay. So I just to first clarify, so Parks Canada led the initiative for the planning phase of the initial target, and Environment and Climate Change Canada is working on the implementation, including 30 by 30. That being said, I think that what we learned, and I mentioned in my presentation, is that the role of governments, particularly kind of federal governments, really needs to be one of enabler, convener, listener, but not leader in the typical sense, because as my colleagues have said, the importance of grassroots efforts at local and regional scales become more important in the implementation than it does in the planning, I would argue. And I think it also requires of us to be thinking of working in a way with new fora for dialogue and conversation and collaboration. So typically speaking, at least here in Canada, we have kind of very long-lived kind of federal, provincial, territorial fora, for example. The way in which we design kind of our collaborative efforts speaks to an era and a reflection of kind of governmental authorities. But we've all said, I think, in our own ways, the importance of distributing the challenge and amongst different actors across different sectors of society, sharing kind of space for innovation and creativity, for enabling others to bring their best to helping us solve this wicked challenge, really requires of us to think about how do we enable that in practice. You know, clearly it can't be done in old ways. It has to be done in new ways. So what does that look like, and how can we support that, and when do we just simply need to step out of the way as well? I think that's another kind of piece that that needs to be top of mind for different levels of government, at least in terms of really supporting communities and organizations at local and regional scales.
So I'm going to turn now to a question from the audience. And the first one is, what further trinational conversations among scientists, policymakers, and practitioners are needed to support important North American conservation goals? An interesting question for this group in particular.
Yeah, I think maybe I can start. I think that this is a huge opportunity for us to work together in these three nations. You know, we have really thought about this in silos. In the United States, a lot of our protected areas are done through the US Congress, and those are done on a state-by-state basis with their leaders, and they don't necessarily think about this across all borders. And so we've got, I think it's a great opportunity, and this symposium is the first step to think about what are these binational conservation areas that can have that connectivity, that can bring together our peoples, can advance peace, can advance cultural exchanges, can advance a dialogue and science. Some of them can be far apart. We see this in monarch butterflies and how, you know, they're not necessarily just connected on the border, but connected in spaces, or with our bird areas. But I think this is a critically important session. I would hope that just as we had a big discussion on trade in North America, why not have a high-level summit between the leaders of Canada, of the United States, and Mexico about the trinational nature and climate actions? Because we can and should lead the world on this, and I think the symposium can be a first step for that.
Yes, if I can jump in, Rebecca. There's several, as Brian said, there's several for ongoing that we should take advantage and move these conversations into those let's say arenas. One is obviously the North American Wilderness and Protected Area Initiative. Huge area of opportunity there to have discussion. The Commission for Environmental Cooperation related to the Free Trade Agreement. That's another area of opportunity. Again, seeking other tools and instruments that can help us move these 30 by 30 discussions from the classic, let's say, nature-based conservation discussions towards other sectors and other interested parties. Again, trying to build up on that clarity of concepts among different processes. So there's different fora and mechanisms that we could have this discussion on. Canada and Mexico are part of the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy that we committed to 100% sustainable managed areas under national jurisdiction. So there's spaces to have this discussion without any doubt, and we have to take the 30 by 30 discussion there and try to get our hands towards it and clarity of vision. Thank you, Rebecca.
Great. Nadine, anything to add, or I can move on to our last question?
Retweet. Nope, all good.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left. So perhaps rather than posing another specific question from the audience, maybe just give each of you a chance to offer any concluding remarks, any other additional thoughts that you'd like to share as we conclude the panel.
We can start with Nadine.
Okay, thank you. So just a couple of thoughts to conclude the session from my perspective. I think what I would encourage everyone to reflect upon and what I've tried to communicate is really the importance of not only focusing on the what we need to achieve, but the how we need to achieve it. And if we don't design processes that are purposefully inclusive, it means that we won't have the durability of results that we desire to have in the long term, nor will we reach those kind of really creative solutions and broaden our tent to include others that don't typically form part of these kind of conversations on the expansion of protected and conserved areas. So really, process is a big part of how, and by doing so, we really leverage the experience, the knowledge, the expertise that exists in different segments of society. And it, you know, in our brief few years of experience, it really, we were able to accomplish a great deal as a result of that. So I'd really encourage folks, you know, to really focus on how you undertake the work as much as what you undertake, because the challenge requires it of us.
Excellent point, Nadine. We're officially out of time, so we'll just brief remarks from Brian and Andrew to conclude the panel.
Sure, I would say that 30 by 30 is not a nice to have. It's a must have to reach the Paris Climate Agreement goals, to sustain the wildlife abundance that we care about and value on this planet. But it's also, so it's a huge challenge that we must achieve, but it's also a great opportunity to do, as Nadine said, to rethink about how we do conservation, to center those voices that haven't been at the forefront that must be to get us there. If we have that hopeful vision, we can make a major change for our country that we must achieve together.
And I would just only add to Nadine's and Brian's remarks, leadership not only comes from presidents or prime ministers, leadership comes from all of us. It's fundamental that we together join forces for this needed, as Brian said, a target for not only the well-being of us, but the well-being of nature and the planet. Cheers.
Thank you all so much to the panelists. What an excellent discussion. Back over to you, Louise.